Time has continued to move mostly forward, which means you all get to hear me talk about some more games. So let's get into what I played in July. The game I spent the most time with during the month was V Rising, an isometric vampire-themed action survival crafting game. As a disclaimer, I played this for a sponsored video on Iron Pineapple's channel. I personally have not been paid to play it or sponsored by V Rising to talk about it, so I have no obligations to Stunlock Studios or anyone else related to it. This is all to say that my opinions are not being filtered through anyone else, but feel free to take whatever I say with a grain of salt due to me being in that video. But also, you should just take everything everyone ever says with a grain of salt, probably. Anyway, I had a lot of fun with V Rising. As I've said in the past with co-op games, I'm sure a big part of the enjoyment came from just playing something with friends. Honestly, I had a good time with Elden Ring Reforged on raid mode with Pine and Yako, and that was an utter nightmare. Point is, a lot of games are just better with other people, but I do think that V Rising itself is pretty solid. It centers around seeking out bosses and killing them in order to unlock new abilities, weapons, gear, and constructions you can make at your base. One thing I really liked about how it works is that you are never locked into a build. The way your character plays comes down to the weapons and abilities you decide to equip, and these can be switched pretty much whenever. This makes it easy to experiment with what vibes best for you and also adapt to whatever you're fighting. And this process of figuring out how to take on all the bosses ended up being the most fun part of the game for me. For the most part, bosses can be split into two categories, those being roaming bosses and arena bosses. Roaming bosses can be found all across the overworld and generally are a bit more straightforward in terms of what they can do. The challenge of them mostly comes from taking them on while also dealing with the chaos that can come from every other aspect of the overworld, whether it be sunlight or other enemies. I thought these were cool, but for the most part were only memorable when we faced them under less than ideal circumstances. The arena bosses, on the other hand, were pretty much always memorable and tons of fun. As they are in a contained environment, they end up having way more stuff going on, and figuring out how to overcome their various twists was always a lot of fun. They felt like just the right amount of challenge where it couldn't be taken on mindlessly, but they also didn't take forever to beat. Some of them are also just really inspired in terms of concept, which I love, as I think something being interesting is generally better than it just being traditionally good. One thing I'd recommend is playing on brutal difficulty. We did the first half of the game on normal and found it to be a bit on the easy side, but after getting a bunch of comments on Pine's video about how the higher difficulty actually changes up boss fights in notable ways, we bumped it up. And yeah, this was a great change to make. I love when higher difficulties do more than just adjust numbers, as I'd much rather have a new phase or wrinkle to a boss fight than things just being spongier. So the devs did a great job with that. Now, as much as I loved the combat side of the game, that really is only half the experience. Frankly, depending on how you play, it is probably less than half of the experience, as the survival crafting part of it can take up a lot of time. To be clear, if you like survival crafting games, then this probably won't be a problem for you, but as someone who is a bit more lukewarm on them, I found it to be a bit grindy for my liking, especially as we neared the end of the game. While it technically is possible to beat bosses at any point if you're good enough, to stand a reasonable chance, you need to be at or near the same gear level as them. Early on, we were mostly able to keep up with the needed resource gathering as we looked for bosses, but at a point, we had to be way more intentional with it. And while I enjoyed chatting with Yako and Pine as we mindlessly gathered stuff, we were still mindlessly gathering stuff. I don't know, maybe that is just the point of survival crafting games, but yeah, after a while, I just wanted to keep moving on with the bosses and not have to spend time on gathering and crafting. Luckily for me, as Pine and Yako have a little more flexibility in their schedules than I currently do, they were able to jump on and do some grinding while I was offline, which was great as it meant I never got fully fatigued by that part of the game and largely just got to engage with what I liked the most. So yeah, my advice is get friends who will do the part of the game that you're not interested in doing. I do also want to mention that to V Rising's credit, you are given a lot of customization options around the survival crafting elements, so you can change how long things take to make and how much of a resource you receive when gathering. So we were able to cut down even more on grinding time, which also helped. The last thing I want to talk about with it is it does a lot of interesting things with its vampire theming. From sucking the blood of enemies to get bonuses based on their type and strength, to having to weave between shadows during the daytime to avoid the sunlight, it has a lot of engaging mechanics that make you feel like a vampire TM. All in all, there is a lot here I really loved, but I do think the resource gathering can get pretty repetitive by the end. Again, for people who love survival crafting games, it probably won't feel like an issue, but as someone who really just cared about taking on the bosses, I think I would have had way less fun with it if Yako and Pine hadn't gathered stuff when I was offline. If you have a couple friends to play with you, it is easily worth a shot. That said, I can't really speak to how fun it is to play single player, so so I'd say try to find a review for someone who can if that is your only way to play. Alongside V Rising, I also played Dark Messiah of Might and Magic, and it fucking slaps. I came across it when I was doing research for my Skyrim video. I was trying to find other games from that era that did first-person melee combat, and it came up a bunch in my search, and I'm glad it did because it's a ton of fun. It's Arcane Studios' second game, and really feels like the prototype for what Dishonored would eventually become. Now, to preface, it does have a fair bit of jank to it, and I think some of the jank is made worse by playing it on a modern machine, which it does not seem optimized for. But I found the ideas behind the jank to be so fun and interesting that it didn't bother me all that much. What the game is probably best known for is its kick, and for good reason, as it feels great to land and has tons of situational uses, whether it be to create spacing when surrounded by a group of enemies, or to knock foes into a hazard or off a ledge. When all else fails, it is the best option to turn to. But of course, it's not just a kicking game. As it is an immersive sim, you can interact with all sorts of objects in the environment to get a leg up and use various abilities to manage enemies in neat ways. My favorite attack in the whole game is the ice spell, which can be used to freeze enemies in place or create a hazard on the ground that they can slip on. Setting up these little traps and having enemies walk right into them just feels really good, and I love that there is more to the spells than them just doing slightly different types of damage. While the game doesn't go super deep into the potential of spells, it does enough to be interesting and give value to the different types of magic. The swordplay itself is also pretty fun, especially in combination with all those other elements. You actually have to vary your moves and pay attention to what the enemy is doing in order to get good hits in. The story is very much what you would expect from a mid-2000s video game, which is to say that it is pretty goofy and stupid. It's mostly forgettable, but there certainly is some dumb fun to be had with its characters and narrative. That fun will more so be laughing at it than with it, but there is value in that. All in all, it has a really cool combat system with tons of clever ideas that make it a lot of fun to play if you can get past some of the jankiness. After that, I got sent a review code for Fallen Leaf, an indie platformer inspired by the likes of Mega Man and Castlevania that does a pretty solid job of paying homage to them, although I don't think it really gets out from under their shadows in the way some other indie games with similar inspirations have been able to. It is made up of a ton of short stages that you access through an overworld, and despite this sort of segmented approach, there is still a really nice cohesion between the stages. Where one ends is pretty much where the next begins, so instead of playing through stages that are at best just sort of thematically similar, you really do feel like you're working your way through this world. The gameplay, at least at the start, largely consists of running and gunning and using special items with limited uses that help you with specific situations. There's a boomerang that goes a bit farther than your gun, and an axe which can be thrown at an arc, and pretty much all of them just allow you to hit enemies that are placed in different spots. While nothing in the game is all that revolutionary, it is executed really well, especially the enemy placement. It might sound like a weird thing to compliment, but I don't know, I felt like I had to focus more on the enemies and what they were doing than I generally do when playing platformers, and I was regularly faced with interesting combinations of enemies to get past, which was a lot of fun. While I enjoyed the normal enemies, I did find the bosses to be a bit of a mixed bag. Some are super easy and therefore unmemorable, but others provided a really nice challenge. I mostly just wish there had been more of them. It's kind of lacking on bosses, to be honest. One thing the game does that sets it apart from its inspirations is that when you clear a stage, it nets you a unique reward, and I was a bit mixed on this as well. The vast majority of the rewards are either things you can sell to get gold or things you can give to various people that can be found in towns, typically in exchange for items that increase your health or magic. It definitely can feel good to come across an item that someone told you they needed, but the process of matching NPCs to items can get a bit grating over time. Like, there are a ton of NPCs in this game, and not all of them are tied to the items you find. Some just have 1 or 2 lines of dialogue that sometimes can be charming, but generally are filler. The issue is you can't tell who is who beforehand, so I felt incentivized to talk to every person in every town I came across in order to see if they needed one of the items I had found, and as there are so many people, this took a significant chunk of time. Also, it is easy to forget where every NPC is located, which meant spending even more time checking various towns as I got relevant items. I wish they had cut down on the number of towns and NPCs in the game. I would have much preferred if there was just one huge central hub area that you keep coming back to, as it wouldn't have disrupted the flow of play as much and made it less of a hassle to get items to the right people. And to be clear, I don't think something being a hassle is inherently bad, but I don't think it adds anything here. The effect it had on me was that after a while, I just didn't want to engage with that part of the game. Now I'm gonna keep complaining a bit and focus on something that is mostly a me problem, but as I've made a career out of talking about me problems, maybe it would be a you problem as well. The game has a handful of characters you can unlock that change up the gameplay in pretty significant ways. And like, I know most people will think this is a good thing, and it probably is, as it makes the game more playable and gives players choices in how they want to approach things, but I actually found myself struggling a lot on deciding who to play with. The first two characters you get are Leaf and Petal. They play pretty much the same, except Petal can jump higher and she shoots 2 projectiles at the same time that go a shorter distance instead of just 1. I don't know this for certain, but it really does feel like the placement of platforms and enemies are designed with their moveset in mind. Every level can obviously be completed by any character, but I found the challenge to feel less consistent when using anyone else, especially the melee characters, as some parts are just way easier while others are much harder. The part I struggled with most is that about halfway through the game, the character Thorn is unlocked, and playing as her is just way more fun than playing as any other character. And again, this may sound like a good thing, and also again, it probably is, but I found myself conflicted about it as I felt like I was playing an entirely different game all of a sudden. And while I'm sure that the devs would say that the intended experience is to play as whoever you want to play as, I don't know that the level design always supported that. It felt like I should be playing with Leaf. Part of me wished I'd never been introduced to anyone but Leaf so that I could have just kept experiencing the different ways his moveset would be tested, and another part of me wished that Thorn had been the main character the whole game and everything had been designed expressly around her moveset instead. As I said at the start of this, I do understand that this is mostly a me problem, but yeah, once I hit the second half of the game, it was hard not to wonder what experience would be the best. And like, it is clear that the devs do want you to experiment, as you can swap between characters on the fly, so I don't know, maybe I just need to embrace the call for experimentation more, but I still think as so much of the game feels crafted around Leaf's abilities, playing as anyone else feels a little weird, even when they are way cooler. I will say there is a fair argument to be had that the different characters cover the weak spots of others, so the best way to play is by swapping all the time based on the situation, and yeah, depending on how you approach games, this may work really well for you, but I found that when playing with efficiency in mind, Leaf was the answer in most situations. Also, as the special weapon system that I mentioned before addresses most of Leaf's weak points, it makes it even less necessary to use anyone else. I've spent way too much time on this. Point is, I think the introduction of multiple characters shifted the focus in a way that created a more uneven experience for me, but I also wouldn't be surprised if this inclusion is what sells a lot of you on wanting to get the game. It's hard for me to fully call the choice good or bad, it just didn't really work for me. Anyway, if you like Mega Man, you will like Fallen Leaf. It is a fun time with really well crafted stages, and even though I found myself conflicted with the addition of other characters, it does add a lot of replayability, providing a good amount of bang for your buck. Once that was done, I ended the month with Curse Crackers for Whom the Bell Toils. It's a movement-based platformer that was developed by Colorgrave, an indie studio I've been following for a little while now, as they made a game called Prodigal that I played last year and really liked. So I was interested in seeing how they handled a completely different genre, and it didn't disappoint. Like pretty much everything Colorgrave has made, it feels like it could have existed on the Game Boy Color, and this made playing it feel both fresh and nostalgic. Its pixel art and chiptune soundtrack reminded me of long car rides where I prayed that my batteries wouldn't run out before we got wherever we were traveling to. But of course, these aspects as well as the gameplay itself are far more complex than anything that actually could have existed on the Game Boy Color. Your character, Belle, has a handful of movement options to overcome the various obstacles, and once you start to understand the levels and the full capacity of her movement kit, you can zoom through stages in extremely satisfying ways. Part of what makes you feel like you're going so fast is that the screen is pretty small relative to your character, and this was one thing I found myself sometimes feeling mixed about. It obviously complements the style the game is going for, but it makes it hard to react to what's ahead as there isn't much time between you seeing something and hitting it, which led me to be far more cautious than I would have liked to be. It's one of those games where being able to go fast is more about memorizing the level than it is about reacting to it, which I think I like a little less. The secrets are where this game really shines. There are so many spread across the world, and finding them always feels special and leads to bigger, very interesting things, so they are definitely worth looking for and getting. They add a nice additional layer to the game to consider. I don't have much else to say on it. It's a really solid game, and if you're yearning for a certain era and want a smooth platformer with a lot of meat on it, this is that. Anyway, that's all I've got. I'll see you next time unless I decide to stop doing this. Also, don't worry, I'll catch up on these before this year is done. Unless I don't. Okay, bye.